At the bottom of the abandoned well, Sushika, which lies 12 kilometers from Ante Petrovic's oil mill, the police find charred oak hoops and a simple keypad mobile phone. The device belongs to history student Marko Lukic, who disappeared 8 months ago. On the metal rings, experts discover traces of sealing wax with the coat of arms of the Archaeological Museum. Who Marko was, what he was doing at the oil mill that night, and why his belongings ended up at the bottom of the well. This is now the main puzzle of the case. On the morning of the 11th of May 2012, the investigation team arrived at the abandoned well named Sushika. The area lies in a remote location, far from busy roads and settlements. All around, dense forest and half-destroyed buildings, remains of a long-closed farm. The work began in the early morning and stretched until late evening. At 7 meters depth, the investigators lifted burned metal hoops of an oak barrel. The flames had deformed the metal so severely that it was difficult to identify its original purpose. Somewhat later, a Nokia mobile phone was found, an old and simple keypad device with a broken display. The IMEI number pointed to the owner, 22-year-old Marko Lukic, student of the history faculty who had disappeared without a trace on the 3rd of September 2011. His search had already lasted 8 months. During this time, the police found nothing until these objects emerged from the forgotten well. Their expertise immediately delivered several key clues. On the hoops, a microscopic layer of sealing wax with the imprint of the local archaeological museum's coat of arms was discovered. Lukic's phone had been silent since 22:42 that evening. That was the last confirmed time when the student was still reachable. Additionally, the investigation received a video recording from camera number 2 of the gas station shop Stablenak. It captured an old green Lada Niva with trailer covered with a tarpaulin at 22:10. The car was moving in the direction of Ante Petrovic's oil mill. Suspicion immediately fell on 2 people. The first, Ante Petrovic, owner of the oil mill, a 56-year-old man, quiet, reserved, with the reputation of an honest entrepreneur. But in local circles, rumors had long circulated about his strange nocturnal trips and the smell of burning that periodically wafted from the business premises. The second suspect, the archaeological excavation guard, Nenad Kulic, a 34-year-old man, slim and quiet. Before this case, he had already been prosecuted for selling ancient coins at the local market. At that time, Kulic claimed it had been a random find. The museum checked his statements, the trail proved false, and the case was closed. But now, after the discovery of the sealing wax on the barrel, the investigators became interested in the coins again. Were these coins not part of a larger event in which the missing student Marko Lukic was also involved? While this line of investigation remained open, it was again checked more carefully. The investigators quickly obtained court order number 173/2012 and began investigating Ante Petrovic's financial operations. Accounts, payments, money movements, everything was thoroughly and systematically processed. Special attention was paid to bank account activity during the time of the student's disappearance, particularly large or unusual transactions. On this day, locals also gathered at the well. Among them was the father of the missing student, a quiet person who kept apart from everyone and attentively followed the police work. He hoped to find at least something that could shed light on his son's disappearance. In the evening came a message from forensic medicine. On the inside of the metal hoops, blackened tissue fibers were discovered. The experts confirmed. These were remains of human clothing that had been burned together with the barrel. The investigators are now finally convinced that the objects found in the well are connected to Marko Lukic's disappearance. But the main questions remained unanswered. What exactly happened that night? Why did the students' belongings end up here? And who tried so carefully to erase the traces of the crime? In the next phase of investigation, they will dedicate themselves to examining Petrovic's financial operations. which could explain much in this tangled case. On the morning of the 2nd of September 2011, Ante Petrovic, owner of a small oil mill, spends time at Zadar Kreditna Bank. The employees are accustomed to seeing him regularly, always correct, quiet and precise in financial matters. Usually every transaction had a clear purpose and documented confirmation. On this day, Petrovic immediately withdraws 45,000 kuna in cash. The purpose is not specified. Petrovic does not appear worried or agitated. The bank employee later noted to the police that the entrepreneur acted naturally as usual, evenly and calmly. The only unusual detail was the absence of an explanation for such a large sum. Ante normally preferred cashless payments and carefully tracked accounting documentation. At 12:35, the external surveillance camera of Pakistan Harbour captured Petrovic in the company of an unknown man. The VHS camera captured their greeting, a brief handshake and the handover of a package by Petrovic. The video does not allow recognition of what exactly is contained within it. Later, it turns out that the unknown man was a restorer from Šibenik who periodically collaborated with the oil mill. He restored antique oak barrels on behalf of the business. During the first interrogation, the restorer gave clear explanations. He categorically denied receiving cash and emphasized that all payments from Petrovic were carried out exclusively by bank transfer. He provides the police with corresponding receipts and payment documents. All records confirm his words. There are no cash payments and never were. When Ante Petrovic is summoned to clarify these facts, he says confidently that he handed over exactly the withdrawn cash to the restorer. According to Ante, the restorer preferred cash to avoid unnecessary banking procedures. However, these claims stand in direct contradiction to the official statements and documents of the restorer. The investigation gains access to the oil mill's bookkeeping. There the investigators find an unusual detail: a carbon paper copy of a check in the name of Marko Lukic, that very history student who worked at the oil mill. The amount of the check, exactly 45,000 kuna. At first glance, it becomes clear that the sum withdrawn by Ante was intended for the student. However, upon detailed examination of the document, it turns out that the check was cancelled on the same day by the bank with code ERR-53. Technical error. The cancelled check was still kept among the valid documents, as if it had not been removed in time or forgotten to be destroyed. Initially, the police consider this check as evidence that the large sum was intended exactly for Marko. However, the bookkeeping confirms that due to the technical error, the payment did not go through. The money never reached Marko Lukic's account. The investigation is temporarily forced to consider this version as a false trail and seek other explanations. On the same evening, already after the failed transaction with the check, the surveillance camera of an ATM in the center of Pakistan again captures Petrovic. At 23:14, he withdraws an additional 4,500 kuna. On the recording, it can be noted that Ante does not appear nervous or agitated, rather slightly concerned. A few minutes later, the camera of the Atlantic Casino captures Petrovic calmly entering the establishment. The casino was known to locals, but for Petrovic, this was not a usual place to visit. This trip to the casino becomes a new puzzle. The investigation tries to understand whether the two cash withdrawals on one and the same day are somehow connected. The large sum in the morning and the small sum at night, before entering the casino. Petrovic's behavior contradicts his usual caution and prudence. At this moment, the investigator decides to check the official documents related to Marko Lukic's employment. Immediately, a request is directed to the accounting department of the oil mill to examine the original of the student's employment contract. The investigation suspects that if there were any unofficial agreements, this could be the starting point of further events that led to Marko's disappearance. 3 weeks before his name appeared in the police records, student Marko Lukic suddenly postponed taking important exams. For his fellow students, such behavior seemed strange, because Marko was known as a disciplined student who never missed studies without serious reasons. But on this day, he searches among acquaintances specifically for night work. On advertisements that Marco leaves in local student chats and on dormitory boards, it says urgent as well as the note, double rate. Such generosity from employers normally arouses suspicion, but Marco is obviously driven by an acute necessity at that moment. Later, the investigators learn the reason for the urgency in conversation with Marco's mother. She mentions that the son had accumulated debts for living in the university dormitory. The debt amount is considerable for a student, 8,000 kuna. The mother tells calmly and emphasizes that the son had never before gotten into difficult financial situations. She does not know the reason for the debt formation and suspects that Marco did not want to worry her with unnecessary details. This version is also confirmed by Marco's fellow student named Pavel. He explains to the investigators that Marco had yet another strange financial expense. The student had long wanted to buy an expensive smartwatch, but could not afford a completely new model. Finally, he found an advertisement and bought a used copy, giving the seller only a down payment, exactly 2,000 kuna. He promised to pay the remaining sum later. The investigation carefully examines the story with the watch. The police ask Pavel direct questions and try to understand where this watch is now and why Marco did not pay definitively. The fellow student answers confidently that Marco could not collect the full sum and that he had not seen the watch after that deal. Pavel also remembers that the seller of the watch was a local young reseller of electronics named Branko. This name is immediately noted by the police. Branko has a dubious reputation. He is known for small deals and frequent trips to neighboring countries. Branko quickly becomes a person of interest for the police. During the first conversation, he confirms the deal with Marco. He also confesses that he gave the student the contact of a Slovenian number, claiming that that person often offered good money for simple work that was usually performed at night. Branko himself denies that he knew the details of this work. During a search at Branko's, however, suspicious items are found. 2 coins that outwardly resemble Roman ones. At first, this seems to be a significant clue, especially given Marco's connection to the museum. The coins are sent for expert examination, but soon the experts conclude that these are ordinary souvenirs that have no historical value. The investigation is forced to set aside this thread temporarily. The investigators continue to check Marco Lukic's telephone activity. When examining the detailed roaming data of his mobile phone, they find another suspicious moment. In the evening, one day before the disappearance, on the 2nd of September 2011 at 23:14, Marco makes a short call to that Slovenian number that Branko had given him. The conversation lasts only 26 seconds, and this is enough for the police to urgently request official information from the Slovenian operator Mobitel SI. Who the subscriber was and what connection to Marco might exist remains a secret for now. The investigator immediately sends an official request to Mobitel SY asking to provide data of the number holder and the history of his activity. This Slovenian number has now become an important point of the investigation, connecting the student's financial problems and his disappearance. For the police, this is a new important clue, and possibly it will be exactly this that sheds light on the true reason for the night work and the hasty financial decisions of Marko Lukic in the last days before the disappearance. Against the background of the increasingly tangled investigation, an unexpected witness appears who can significantly influence the course of the case. It becomes the local shepherd Ivo Racic, who lives in a small hut about 1 kilometer from the Sušika well. The man contacts the police only 8 months after Marko Lukic's disappearance. It is unclear to the investigators why he remained silent for so long and why he decided right now to tell about what happened. Ivo explains cautiously, avoiding details. He confesses that on the night of the 3rd of September 2011 he saw a strange fire, but decided not to report this to the police. Soon the reason for his long silence becomes clear. Ivo Racic had previously been convicted of poaching. He was sentenced to a suspended sentence. Therefore, he perceived any unnecessary interaction with the police as a personal threat. Out of fear of getting into trouble again, he preferred not to interfere. But there is another important point. In December 2011, Ivo nevertheless told the local district policeman about the strange nighttime incident. During a chance encounter in the village, the district policeman noted the shepherd's story and promised to take care of it. However, an official report was never created. Later, it becomes known that the district policeman referred to the loss of this information, a fact that is recorded in the files as a case of corporate negligence. During a detailed interrogation, Ivo shares significant details with the investigation. He describes the fire at the well as unusual. It burned with a dark red flame and had a pronounced smell of burning oil. He cannot name the time exactly, but he points out confidently that this happened deep in the night. The shepherd was accustomed to unusual phenomena in these places, but he saw such a fire for the first time. To the investigator's direct question about transport at the well, Ivo answers calmly that he clearly saw a green Jeep with trailer. The car stood motionless by the abandoned well, and the people by the fire appeared like silhouettes, indistinguishable in the darkness. The shepherd's description of the transport completely matches the recording from the Stablinach gas station camera. Based on the shepherd's first descriptions, the investigators begin to consider the version of accidental spontaneous combustion. The area near Ante Petrovic's oil mill had previously been the site of spontaneous fires related to production waste. Used oil, barrels soaked with oil, all of this could have been the cause of a fire, especially in the dry season. However, the crime technicians soon give a clear conclusion. After analyzing the samples from the metal rings, it becomes clear that the oil was mixed with resin and formed an intentional fire accelerant. Spontaneous combustion is completely excluded. The laboratory's conclusion leaves no doubt. The fire at the well was intentionally ignited. An important step becomes the confirmation of another fact related to the sealing wax found on the rings of the burned barrel. The investigation establishes a direct match of the sealing wax with the coat of arms used by the Archaeological Museum. The laboratory analysis confirms that the sealing wax is identical to the sample that the museum uses when marking important exhibits and shipments. The match is absolutely precise. The probability of error is completely excluded. There is no duplicate of such sealing wax. Now the investigation's attention returns again to the Archaeological Museum. The investigators begin to examine internal documents and contacts of museum employees more closely and try to establish how exactly the sealing wax got onto the rings of the barrel found at the bottom of the abandoned well. The next phase of the investigation: interrogations of the Archaeological Museum workers, checking the recording journals and internal instructions for marking exhibits and containers with sealing wax. At 22:10, the video surveillance camera of the store at the gas station Stablinach captures a green Lada Niva with trailer. The recording is in color. Good lighting makes it possible to distinguish details clearly. The passenger seat of the car comes into view. For several seconds, it can be seen that the passenger wears a smartwatch with characteristic white strap and black stripe. Exactly such a watch had Marko Lukic recently acquired, paying only a down payment for it. The cashier of the store who works the shift becomes a witness of that evening. The woman later describes to the police in detail the appearance of the driver. She remembered his nervous behavior. He literally twitched, constantly looked around and avoided eye contact. When the driver opened the car window to pay for the gasoline, she felt a sharp, burning smell, as from a recently extinguished fire. When the police again approach Ante Petrovic, the owner of the oil mill, with the question about his movements that night, he answers without hesitation that he drove to get olives, and he claims that together with him was a seasonal worker who can confirm his words. The investigation quickly checks this claim by turning directly to the workers of the enterprise. The employees of the oil mill officially confirm that on that day the warehouse from where olives are normally loaded was already completely empty at 20 o'clock, and all seasonal workers had long gone home. This contradicts Petrovic's words and drastically changes the investigation's attitude toward his statements. The second version that arose during the analysis of the video recording was that the guard of the archaeological excavations, Nenad Kulic, could have been sitting in the passenger seat. The size of the passenger matched, according to preliminary estimates, quite well with Kulich's size, which gave reason to check this version. However, the detailed check of medical facilities excluded Kulich from the list of suspects. The policeman learned that he was urgently hospitalized at 21:35 on the same day with acute appendicitis and remained under strict medical observation in the hospital until the morning of the next day. This fact was documentarily confirmed, and the version about Kulich's involvement was completely closed. Thus, the original assumption of the investigation that the passenger could have been exactly Kulich is completely excluded. The police have no basis to further suspect him and return to the figure of Ante Petrovic and the unknown passenger. During this time, the forensic technicians begin to examine Petrovic's green Lada Niva more closely, which becomes the most important piece of evidence in the case. In the laboratory, the road dust is examined that was taken from the wheels and undercarriage of the car and compared with soil samples from the area of the well, Sushika. The result of the analysis proves to be decisive. The experts establish a clear match of the mineralogical composition of the road dust from Petrovic's Lada Niva with soil samples from the area of the cast well, Sushika. This precise match excludes the probability of accidental arrival of this dust on the car and clearly shows that the car was at the well that night. From this moment, the investigation definitively excludes coincidence and is convinced that the green Lada Niva is directly connected with the disappearance of Marko Lukic. The investigation group decides to open a new phase of investigation that focuses on the detailed reconstruction of the movement route of the green Lada Niva. For this, additional data from video surveillance cameras located on possible routes of the car are requested in order to establish Petrovic's movements that night as precisely as possible. For the police, it becomes critically important to answer where exactly the car went after visiting the gas station and why the driver was so disturbed that even a random witness noticed his behavior. On the morning of the 4th of September 2011, Marko Lukic's mother finds a strange note while going through her son's things in the dormitory room that was pinned to the bulletin board above his desk. It is a small flyer with the inscription, "Night trips, double payment." The telephone number in the advertisement immediately draws her attention. Slovenian area code +386. She recognizes it because she remembers that her son had previously mentioned this contact in conversations about additional work. For the mother, this becomes a disturbing signal, about which she immediately informs the police. The telephone number immediately comes under the sharp attention of the investigation. The police inquiry to the operator Mobitel SI returns with clear, though not too consoling, results. The SIM card was registered to a Slovenian one-day company, Maribor Cargo DOO. According to official records of Slovenia, the company was created and closed in a short time, liquidated on the 12th of October 2011, a little more than a month after Marko's disappearance. The company left practically no traces in public records except the name and liquidation date. Contact details of its representatives are missing. An office at the official addresses has not existed for a long time. The police immediately try to call the indicated number, but the phone proves to be inactive. The operator confirms that the connection was interrupted shortly after the liquidation of the company. The investigation requests more detailed data about the traffic of the number from the Slovenian operator and receives an important clue. According to the traffic log, the subscriber received an incoming text message on the evening of the 3rd of September 2011 that contained only coordinates. These coordinates clearly pointed to the port of Ploče. At the same time, the police completes the verification of the version with the reseller Branko. Earlier, 2 coins had been found at his place that externally resembled Roman ones. The expert opinion completely refutes their historical value and confirms that these are ordinary tourist souvenirs that have nothing to do with the case. Branko is officially excluded from the list of suspects. His role and version are completely closed. Meanwhile, the police begin examining the video surveillance recordings in the port of Ploče. The customs control camera in PAL format captured the morning events of the next day, the 4th of September 2011 at 6:50. On the recording, a man can clearly be seen renting a small boat. Cargo can be noticed in the boat. 3 large polyethylene bags. The man in the video proves to be the same unknown person who was previously seen on the surveillance camera recordings of the port Pakistan together with Ante Petrovic. The policeman noticed that more and more threads lead to port activities and transports of some suspicious cargo. But what exactly was in those bags is unknown for now and is specifically not specified. The investigators direct an official inquiry to the Meteorological Service of Croatia with the demand to provide a detailed report about the weather conditions on the night from the 3rd to the 4th of September 2011. For further steps of the investigation, it is necessary to understand exactly what conditions prevailed that night and whether it was possible to carry out unnoticed movements over the water from Ploče or back. The examination of conditions at sea becomes the logical continuation of the search for connections between Marco's nighttime disappearance and the strange harbor reports. On the 17th of January 2012, the investigation receives new momentum thanks to the testimony of truck driver Tomislav Kovac. During a routine check of freight journals at the checkpoint on the highway, he unexpectedly informs the investigator that he possesses information that could be related to the case of Marko Lukic's disappearance. Tomislav takes out his smartphone and shows the investigator a photo of a page from his logbook. The entry, dated to the late evening of the 3rd of September 2011, is brief and concrete. ZD 911 AN, Green Niva, fire at Sušica. The photo was taken almost immediately after he noticed the unusual activity at the abandoned well. Tomislav explains that he made this note because he decided to record the suspicious situation just in case. The investigators immediately compare the state license plate indicated in Tomislav's journal with the database of the local traffic police. On the same day, an official response comes from the LDPS. The car with license plate ZD 911 AN, Green Lada Niva, belongs to Ante Petrovic. On the 2nd of September 2011, this car was already stopped during the day by a patrol and penalized for violating the seatbelt requirement. Owner: confirmed. Petrovic is again summoned for interrogation and must explain why his car was noticed by the truck driver on the night of Marko's disappearance. Ante, maintaining outward calm, immediately responds that he had given the car to his cousin that evening and himself did not know where it was at night. The investigators immediately check Petrovic's words. The cousin is summoned for a separate interrogation, where he categorically denies Ante's words. He explains that he did not take the car, did not ask for it, and had not seen Petrovic at all that evening. His words are fully documented and recorded in the investigation materials. Now the fact that Ante Petrovic is lying is clearly confirmed. During this time, Petrovic's lawyer attempts to cast doubt on the key evidence: the photo of truck driver Tomislav Kovac's journal. The defense claims that such a photo can easily be falsified and demands an expertise of the image's authenticity. The investigation immediately sends the photo for independent technical expertise of the EXIF data. The experts carefully check the digital markings and conclude that the image and the entry were made exactly on the indicated date and were not subjected to any changes or editing. Thus, the attempt to discredit the important evidence fails, and the lawyer's false trail is officially closed. After receiving the expertise, the prosecutor's office gives permission for a partial search of the premises of Petrovic's oil mill. During the search of the facilities, an international DHL package is discovered in a side room that had not been noticed by the investigation earlier. On the packaging and in the folds of the adhesive tape, the forensic technicians find a special type of cast dust that, according to mineralogical composition, is completely identical to that found earlier on the wheels of Petrovic's green Lada Niva and at the Sušica well. This discovery becomes a new crucial piece of evidence that for the first time directly connects the oil mill and the location of student Marko Lukic's disappearance. Based on the discovered evidence, the prosecutor's office immediately begins preparing an order for a complete search of all property belonging to Ante Petrovic. The decision is made after consultation with the investigators, who are now certain that other significant evidence could be found on the oil mill premises. At this moment, the investigation finally focuses on the figure of Ante Petrovic, who now finds it increasingly difficult to explain the emerging facts. The investigation gradually moves into the final phase. The investigators again carefully examine the financial documents of Ante Petrovic's oil mill and notice a suspicious payment document. a carbon paper copy of a check in the name of Marko Lukic for exactly 8,000 kuna. The document is dated to the evening of the 3rd of September 2011 and personally signed by Ante Petrovic. Next to it stands a system note, ERR 53, which means cancellation of the payment. This sum completely matches Marko's debts for dormitory housing, which his mother had reported earlier. The question now is why the check was cancelled immediately after being issued. The investigation immediately brings in a labor inspector for verification to clarify the official status of Marko Lukic at the oil mill. The inspector carefully checks the documents and concludes that the student's contract was officially concluded and was valid until the 30th of November 2011. Violations in the execution or in the payments were not discovered. The question with the cancelled check remains open. The investigator again summons Ante Petrovic for explanation. When asked about the reason for the payment cancellation, Ante responds briefly and confidently, "Marko did not come to the shift that night. The money was only given for worked hours." However, the investigators immediately find a contradiction. According to the work time records, the shift schedule from the 3rd of September at 21:30 shows Marko's signature, which confirms his presence at the workplace. This is the direct opposite of Petrovic's statements. Petrovic's defense suggests that Marko might have signed the schedule in advance, even before the shift began, and therefore the student's absence does not contradict Ante's words. To verify this version, a graphologist is brought into the case. The expert carefully examines the signature and gives a clear conclusion. The signature was made immediately at the indicated time. The strokes are fresh and executed without pauses and additional layers. This version of the defense is officially refuted and closed. During further verification of the oil mill's warehouse documents, another strange circumstance is discovered. That night, according to the inventory, 3 oak barrels disappeared from the warehouse. The reason for the disappearance is not indicated. Movements are not registered. In parallel, the police request the documentation from the port of Ploče. The port's freight inventory from the 4th of September shows the acceptance for storage of 3 polyethylene bags with a total weight of 30 kilograms. Experts note that the weight of these bags completely corresponds to the approximate weight of 3 filled standard museum barrels with coins. While this is not yet directly stated, the connection becomes obvious. The collected data testifies that there is a direct and clear connection between the student's disappearance, the missing barrels, and the cargo at the port. The investigation begins to form a unified evidence base that it plans to present to the prosecutor's office. Now the investigators are certain that the events of that night were not accidental, but carried a clearly planned and organized character. On the 20th of February 2013, the court trial in the case of student Marko Lukic's disappearance reaches its climax. On the defendant's bench, the owner of the oil mill, Ante Petrovic. The courtroom is full. Among the spectators, Marko's relatives, journalists, investigators, several witnesses and lawyers. The atmosphere is tense and focused. The prosecutor begins to present in detail the final chain of evidence that was confirmed through months of investigations and expertise. The first thing the court pays attention to is the route that Ante Petrovic's car traveled on the night from the 3rd to the 4th of September 2011. According to reconstruction, Petrovic loaded 3 oak barrels with Roman coins stolen from the archaeological museum into the trailer of his green Lada Niva at 21:45. With him was Marko, who was still alive at that time. Technical expertise confirmed that the weight of the cargo and the passenger was permissible for this car. At 22:10, the car was captured by the camera of the Stablinak gas station. Exactly at this moment, Marko's watch appears in the frame, evidence that the student was really in the car. At 22:35, after 12 kilometers over field roads, the car reached the Sushika well. There, according to the prosecutor's conclusions, the coins were transferred from the barrels into polyethylene bags. Then Ante used a special accelerator, mixture of oil and resin, to ignite the empty barrels. At the same time, Marko, no longer alive, was brought to the well, which the judicial DNA expertise directly states, obtained from the burned clothing fibers. After that, Ante went to Dubrava Bay. The meteorological report confirmed that the night was moonless. The wind did not exceed 2 meters per second, and the Coast Guard patrol was working significantly further south at that time, which secured a free corridor of movement for the defendant. At 3:30 in the morning on the 4th of September, Petrovic arrived at Dubrava Bay, where he loaded the bags with coins onto a boat rented in advance. At 6:50 in the morning of the same day, he handed over the cargo at Ploča port to a representative of the Slovenian one-day company that was registered to that Slovenian number from which Marko had previously received an SMS. The judge specifically focuses on the financial motives of Ante Petrovic. The investigation proved that the 45,000 kuna that Petrovic withdrew from the account was an advance received from the buyer of the stolen coins. The additional 4,500 kuna, withdrawn late in the evening of the same day and spent at the casino, was an attempt to hide illegal income and launder the money. The fake story with the carbon paper check for 8,000 kuna, which was immediately cancelled after issuance, had the goal of hiding the non-payment to Marko for his role in the night work. Marko's signature on the plan confirmed by the graphologist proved to be genuine, placed at 21:30. This meant that Marko completely fulfilled his part of the agreement, but never received the promised money. Petrovic's defense tries as a last argument to point out that Marko's complete remains were never found, and therefore the murder is allegedly not fully proven. The court categorically rejects this argument and explains that the existing fragments and the chain of irrefutable evidence are sufficient. All other versions of the defense previously expressed and checked by the investigation were definitively closed by official expertises and assessments. In the final minutes of the trial, the prosecutor calmly and methodically lists the main evidence and emphasizes the irrefutable connection of Ante Petrovic with the crime scene. He reminds the court of the sealing wax with the museum coat of arms discovered on the tires of the burned barrels. He points to the DHL package with cast dust that perfectly matches the soil found at the Sušica well. The prosecutor also reminds of the photo by truck driver Tomislav Kovač, whose EXEF data confirms authenticity and clearly proves the presence of Petrovic's car at the well on that fateful night. And finally, the prosecutor cites the data from the criminal technical expertise, according to which the road dust taken from Petrovic's Lada Niva exactly matches the mineralogical composition of the crime scene soil. Now no doubts remain about the defendant's guilt. After the prosecutor's closing speech and the defense's last word, the court withdraws for deliberation. After half an hour, the judge returns and reads the verdict. Ante Petrovic is found guilty of the murder of Marko Lukic, theft of historical valuables, and attempted concealment of the crime. The sentence is 22 years, imprisonment with confiscation of property. When being led out of the courtroom, Petrovic speaks dryly and briefly only one word: appeal. The cameras capture his face, without emotions, the gaze completely empty. The court process is finished. In the case, only one element remains unresolved: the identity of the final buyer of the second batch of coins, who appeared in the IP log of the internet auction in Ljubljana. The international request has already been directed, but is still in the stage of waiting for approval. In mysterious circumstances, their daughter disappeared without a trace from the house of an American family late at night. Law enforcement authorities immediately began the search, which soon led them to a series of surprising and unforeseeable discoveries. After the mystery of the disappearance was solved, the investigators were confronted with a new set of unsettling questions that deepened the mystery even further. Rowan Ford, born on the 11th of April 1998 in San Diego, California, soon moved with her mother to Missouri, to the cozy small town of Stella, after her parents' divorce. In their new home, the mother met David, which led to a new marriage and the expansion of the family with children from his first marriage and a daughter born to them together. Thus, Rowan gained 4 siblings, with whom she maintained a warm and friendly relationship. The girl spent most of her childhood outdoors, exploring the town's surroundings on her bicycle, enjoying swimming, and dedicating herself to drawing. She was also actively involved in the local church's Sunday school, where she helped other children and was always the first to arrive. At 9 years old, in November 2007, Rowan already showed a high degree of independence due to her mother's work schedule, who worked nights at a local store, and her stepfather's employment, who worked on the farm during the day. On that day, the 2nd of November, she was home alone. Her mother had gone to her shift and the stepson was still at work on the farm. In the morning, when Colin came home from the night shift around 9, she noticed her daughter's absence from the bedroom. When she asked her husband where Rowan was, he explained that the daughter had decided to spend the night at a friend's house and he had given her his permission. Due to the small size of their town, he did not consider it necessary to ask with whom exactly. Worried, Colin decided to check on Rowan's friends. After crossing a few streets of the small town, it became clear to her that her concern was justified. None of the friends had seen Rowan that night. After unsuccessful searches throughout the town, Colin insisted on informing the police. The sheriff's reaction was immediate. He began with a visit to the family to question David, who had last seen Rowan. The man shared that in the evening after work on the farm, he had gone to his house with his colleague Christopher and an acquaintance Leighton, where they played pool and had a few drinks. After the friends had bought everything necessary for their get-together at the local store, 3 of them made their way to one of their houses, where they spent several hours in a pleasant atmosphere. As it grew dark, Christoph expressed a desire to return to his home in the neighboring town, where he lived in a trailer, and invited Ethan and David to continue the evening at his place. David, having made sure that his stepdaughter Rowan was fast asleep, agreed and went with them. On the way, they stopped to buy additional alcohol and spent the rest of the evening in Christoph's trailer. An hour later, David asked Ethan to drive him back. To avoid an encounter with the police due to his condition after consuming alcohol, Ethan chose less traveled roads. At home, David fell asleep almost immediately but was soon awakened by Rowan, who asked for permission to spend the night at a friend's house. Without much thought, he agreed and fell back asleep. The police met this story with skepticism, especially the decision to let the girl go out at night without asking further questions about her destination. The sheriff suspected that David might be involved in Rowan's disappearance in some way, although there was no solid evidence for it. Throughout the day and deep into the night, the police, along with residents of the town and surrounding settlements, organized a search for the missing Rowan. In the small town of Stella, which has only about 150 souls, the news of her disappearance spread like wildfire, given the family's close connection to the community. Normally, children played carefree in the streets here, but the unexplained disappearance filled the residents' hearts with worry and fear. The first 24 hours of the search ended without any leads or traces of Rowan. The following day, the 4th of November, investigators traveled to a neighboring town to meet with Christoph, who confirmed David's alibi but reported that he had not had any contact with his friend since the girl's disappearance. This led to the expansion of the search operation and the involvement of even more volunteers, yet no traces of Rowan were found. The morning after was marked by the involvement of FBI agents who actively worked on various hypotheses regarding the incident. Doubts were raised about the statements of Rowan's stepfather, as his version of events seemed implausible. All of Rowan's friends were questioned, which confirmed that the girl had not been with them. Repeated interrogations of David led to changes in his statements, which strengthened the suspicions against him and intensified the efforts to solve the case. On the same night the girl disappeared, this person gave contradictory information about his absence. He also mentioned that the girl might have decided to go to a friend's house on her own without asking his permission, leaving the apartment without his knowledge. In the course of the investigation, it was revealed that he had borrowed his mother's car that evening, which had not been previously disclosed to the investigation. Consequently, the investigators decided to seize both his personal pickup truck and the mother's car for a detailed inspection, but no traces of a crime were found. In parallel, the investigators decided to conduct new interviews with Christoph and Newton, as both had spent the evening of the disappearance with the suspect. Christoph was invited to the police station where he repeated his previously stated version of events. He also agreed to a polygraph test, the results of which showed no signs of deception, and he was released shortly thereafter. Only a few hours after leaving the police station and returning to work, Christoph saw Sheriff Clark's car passing by and waved to stop him. Sheriff Clark, the head of the Whitman Police Department, had known Christoph for 17 years and maintained a friendly relationship with his foster parents, which earned him his respect. After the death of Christoph's mother, he often sought Clark's support. At their meeting, they discussed Rowan's disappearance, although Clark was not directly involved in the investigation. Nevertheless, Clark felt that Christoph's behavior seemed strange and suspected he might be hiding something. At a moment when every minute was crucial for the fate of the missing Rowan, Clark decided not to hide his suspicions and sought help from the FBI. He arranged a meeting with the agents and shared his suspicions that Christopher might be concealing important details about the events of that night, possibly even at Christopher's own request. This information could point to his involvement in Rowan's disappearance. The sheriff claimed to have built a relationship of trust with Christopher and was willing to try to convince Christopher to share the truth, fearing the consequences of being involved. On the evening of the same day, Christopher drove to Rowan's mother's house to inquire about the progress of the investigation. In his absence, FBI agents arrived, having decided to speak with Rowan's mother again. When Christopher met them, he confirmed his earlier version of the events of that night, but for the first time, expressed suspicion towards David and offered his help in uncovering the truth. He was even willing to take a risk by suggesting to be used as a decoy with a listening device to obtain a confession from David. However, the agents decided to postpone this plan for the time being and asked Christopher about places where David might have hidden evidence related to the case. On the morning after the police had received information from a man, they began a thorough investigation of the indicated locations and expanded the search radius in the Stella district. At the same time, David was again invited for questioning at the FBI, where he continued to deny any guilt. The attempts to investigate his house were unsuccessful, which left the investigators without evidence. Meanwhile, Christoph visited Sheriff Clark to report on his interactions with the agents. During their conversation, Clark had the feeling that Christoph was hiding something important. After the meeting, the sheriff immediately contacted the investigators and expressed the suspicion that Christoph might have information that could incriminate David. Assuming that Christoph wanted to share important information but was hesitant, the FBI agents insisted that Clark should try to convince him. Given Christoph's repeated contact with the sheriff regarding the case, it was likely that he actually wanted to disclose some key details. On the 7th of November, Christoph was again invited to the police station to obtain his consent to search the safe in David's house, where Christoph was temporarily living after losing his own home, and where his personal belongings were still stored. Christoph agreed without objection to the search of his trailer and his car, provided a DNA sample, and again answered the investigators' questions. When the investigators decided to look more closely into the events of that night and asked Christopher for confirmation of the version presented by David, the situation took an unexpected turn. Christopher revealed that his friend's narrative was not accurate, which prompted the investigators to uncover the true circumstances with even more determination. The pressure from law enforcement only pushed Christopher further away, causing him to defend himself and refuse any further communication under the threat of being accused of Rowan's disappearance. The meeting was cancelled and Christopher left the police station. He rushed to Sheriff Clark that same evening, complaining about the unfair treatment by the investigators and considering the possibility of seeking legal assistance. The sheriff, acknowledging his right to an attorney, nevertheless advised him to understand the motives of the investigation and to continue supporting the search for Rowan. Christopher explained that he was no longer willing to cooperate with the investigators and preferred to communicate exclusively with Clark. In the course of their conversation, under the persistent pressure of the sheriff, Christopher could not hold back his tears, confessed his affection for Rowan, and denied any thought of harming her. He recalled how he had grown close to the young woman, almost becoming a part of her family and receiving the affectionate nickname Uncle Christopher. The sheriff, sensing his emotional state, tried to convince the man to disclose everything he knew about what had happened. At the moment Christopher was giving his statement, visitors entered the police station, distracting Sheriff Clark from the conversation. Clark attended to the visitors, and in the meantime, Christopher left the building unnoticed without revealing the information he had intended to disclose. The sheriff, realizing the gravity of the situation, immediately contacted the FBI to report what had happened. He warned that Christopher was on the edge, ready to reveal everything, but any pressure could lead him to withdraw from further cooperation and instead consult a lawyer. Therefore, Clark suggested giving him time to think, with which the agents agreed. The search continued the next day without interruption, but Rowan was not found. Everything changed on the 9th of November, 1 week after the disappearance, when search parties reached a remote area near Powell, 16 kilometers from Stella. There, in the middle of forests and fields, they discovered a deep, natural depression. Under a layer of leaves and debris, they found what they had been searching for all those days: Rowan. The circumstances of what happened are such that they cannot be described in detail on YouTube. But I hope you can imagine what happened there. After the discovery, the FBI agents contacted Sheriff Clark again to insist on the necessity of interrogating Christopher. It turned out that Christopher had come to the station on the morning of the same day when Clark was not present and had left a message with other staff, emphasizing the urgency of a meeting. The sheriff immediately began searching for Christopher, driving to all possible whereabouts, but the man seemed to have vanished from the face of the earth. The story took its course when Christopher decided to contact Clark himself. The anxiety in his voice was palpable. He spoke of the possibility that someone might be following him. Describing his recent wanderings through the city, which were attempts to clear his head of thoughts, Christopher mentioned a silver car that seemed to be constantly following him. Sheriff Clark assured him that he knew nothing of such surveillance and suggested a meeting to discuss the matter. At the meeting, Christopher appeared extremely tense and expressed the fear that he could be linked in some way to Rowan's disappearance and that someone wanted to retaliate against him for it. Clark suggested going to the station to discuss the matter in more detail, stressing that the situation had escalated and that Christopher should tell everything he knew. In front of the station, Christopher was again overcome with emotion but insisted that he did not want to speak in such a crowded environment. He suggested driving to a more secluded place and mentioned a little-known bridge near the town. After agreeing, they set off for it. Upon arriving at their destination, Christopher unexpectedly extended his hands towards Clark and offered to let him put on handcuffs. The sheriff was confused and replied that it was not necessary. At this, Christopher remarked mysteriously, "After my words, you will see it differently." And he began to speak, at first repeating what the police already knew. That evening, Christopher, along with Ben and David, was relaxing in the trailer. They were continuing to celebrate and drink. When it was time to head home, David asked him for a ride. They decided to use the back roads to avoid an encounter with the police and set off. The story that Christopher later told the sheriff shocked him and left him at a loss. Christopher confessed that on that night he had felt the frightening desire to do something unforgivable to Rowan. "I cannot talk about it on YouTube, but you must understand for yourself what exactly he wanted to do." Christopher, knowing that his friends would be on the road for a while, chose a shorter route via the main road and arrived at David's house first. He quietly crept into Rowan's room, carefully picked up the girl so she wouldn't wake up, and drove with her to his trailer. During his actions, he did not turn on the light and tried to remain unnoticed. After Christopher had done the irretrievable, he planned to bring Rowan home and disappear. But the plans changed when she saw his face in the bright moonlight. Panicked at being recognized, Christopher decided that he had to erase the traces of the crime in such a way that no one, including Rowan, would learn the truth. Ultimately, he made a decision that could no longer be reversed and did something that I also cannot speak about here. Please understand. But I'm trying to explain everything as clearly as possible. Sitting in the car after all that had happened, Christopher thought about ways to get rid of all the evidence and clues. His first thought was to destroy all the evidence by throwing it off the bridge where he had last met Sheriff Clark. Christoph realized that his original plan would be quickly seen through. He drove through the district, thinking about alternatives, and soon came up with a new plan. Near the next town, there was a large pit. He went there to get rid of evidence, but he couldn't manage to cover the pit with branches. They just fell to the bottom because of its enormous size. When he returned home, Christoph noticed traces on his belongings. He also had to get rid of other incriminating items and the rope used in the crime. He gathered everything in a large metal barrel to burn, but realized that an open fire could attract unwanted attention. Finally, he dragged the barrel into the barn and set it on fire there. Sheriff Clark was confused by these events. The whole time he had considered David the culprit and Christoph only a witness who was withholding information. To learn that someone he had known for almost 20 years could do such a thing was a shock to the sheriff. Christoph, who has 3 children from a divorce, had always seemed to be a law-abiding citizen. But the true picture of Christoph's actions destroyed this impression. After telling his story, Christoph voluntarily agreed to go to the police station, and the sheriff did not even consider it necessary to handcuff him. However, after he repeated his confession to the FBI agents, he was arrested. While Christoph expressed his willingness to allow a search of his mobile home and his car, he ended his statement with regret for what had happened, mentioning that he had spent the following days in tears. The investigators, reflecting on his confession, then decided to meet with David and inform him of Christoph's confession. They were troubled by the man's strange behavior and the inconsistency of his statements, which raised the suspicion that he might be concealing his friend's actions. But the next turn of events was even more surprising. After the interrogation, David suddenly changed his story about the events. He claimed that when he came home that night, he noticed Rowan's disappearance from her room and immediately suspected that Christoph might have taken her. He drove to Christoph's house in his mother's car and witnessed what was happening. Instead of trying to save Rowan, David decided to join Christoph and then help him hide the traces of the crime. He concluded that his consciousness was somehow turned off at that moment, and he could not remember anything that happened in the following days. The investigators, confused by this development, turned to Christoph again to ask for explanations regarding David's statements. However, Christoph insisted that David was not involved in the events and that everything happened exactly as he had originally described it. This confused the investigators even more, but Christoph's story was completely consistent with the evidence found. Christoph's statements were confirmed by the results of the medical examination, which helped to clarify the investigation. During the investigation of the area around the trailer, the investigators discovered a barrel full of ashes, and in the car, they noticed human hair. Although they were not completely sure which version of the events was the correct one, the defendants gave confessions that made it possible to arrest David and hand the case over to the courts. During the proceedings, Christoph tried to challenge the use of his statements, claiming that he had not understood their possible use against him and that his rights had been violated. However, the judge rejected his arguments, emphasizing that the statements were made voluntarily. Christoph also sought leniency by highlighting his difficult childhood, the constant changes from his biological parents to foster parents and back, which had left a lasting impression on his personality. An invited expert claimed that signs of mental retardation were found in Christoph. However, this did not save him from being sentenced to a maximum severe punishment in the year 2012, 5 years after the crime. Attempts to appeal the verdict were unsuccessful. The situation with David was more complicated. He confessed to his involvement in the crime, but his version of events differed from Christoph's statements, which posed a risk to the prosecution. A possible trial against David could lead to an annulment of Christoph's verdict and potentially release both of them, as there was no direct evidence, such as DNA. The prosecution could not take this risk. Evidence that David was involved in the crime along with Christoph was never found. The prosecution had considered the possibility of his involvement, but the evidence was not convincing. To avoid an annulment of the verdict against Christoph, the prosecutors made a compromise with David. After he pleaded guilty to 2 charges, he was sentenced to 11 years in prison, of which he served only 5. The verdict caused a lot of resentment, as many believed that David should have received a harsher punishment for his actions. Now it is extremely unlikely that he will be held accountable for this matter again. Meanwhile, Christoph continues to serve his sentence in prison. Fawn Cox, who lived in a house with her parents and younger sisters, came home one evening after work and immediately went to sleep in her room. The next morning, to their astonishment, the family members discovered that an incident had occurred in her room. Born on the 24th of March, 1973, in Kansas City, Missouri, Fawn grew up in a modest 2-story house with her parents and 2 younger sisters in a simple neighborhood. Despite the family's modest income, she was always ready to help her parents, was active in the church community, and found joy in swimming. Her desire to support the family became evident when at the age of 16 she started working at an amusement park, where she was mainly employed at the cash register. In the middle of the summer of 1988, Fawn, the eldest of 3 daughters, returned home from her job at the local amusement park at around 10 o'clock in the evening on the 26th of July. Her mother and her younger sister picked her up by car to spare her the long journey home by public transport. Upon arriving home, Fawn, tired from a long day at work, went straight to sleep, ready for the next workday in the morning. On the morning after that evening, the family discovered something unusual in her room. An incident had taken place. No one in the family had heard anything suspicious that night. It took 31 years for the case to be solved, which was a completely unexpected turn for everyone involved. On that summer night, the temperature did not drop even at night. On the ground floor, where pleasant coolness prevailed thanks to the air conditioning, the parents and Alicia, one of the sisters, were sleeping. Their decision to come down from the 2nd floor was motivated by the desire to escape the unbearable heat. Amber, the sister who was only a year younger than Fawn, spent that night away from home as she was babysitting for a friend's family. Thus, Fawn remained alone on the 2nd floor in her room. When it was time to wake up, Fawn's alarm clock rang, but for some reason was not turned off at the usual time. This prompted the younger sister and the mother to check on her. They found Fawn lying in her bed. They immediately called the emergency services, but the doctors determined that there was no saving the girl. The events leading to this outcome had obviously occurred several hours earlier, as confirmed by the medical experts, who cited an external influence as the cause of what had happened. The police were immediately aware that an investigation full of difficulties lay ahead. Although the crime took place inside the house, where one might expect any sound to wake someone in the family due to the poor sound insulation, nobody heard anything. The explanation for this was the loud air conditioning unit on the ground floor, which drowned out all other sounds. The only thing that broke the silence of that night was the restlessness of the family poodle, which behaved restlessly and barked. However, this behavior was attributed to its condition, as the dog was pregnant, and the family paid it no special attention. After a thorough investigation of the house, the scene of the incident, the investigators came to a series of important conclusions. Their analysis suggested that the perpetrator, or a group of individuals, entered through a window on the 2nd floor at the back of the house. Nearby was an old trailer, which provided easy access to the canopy and further to the window. This window was left open because there was no air conditioning in the house, forcing the residents to look for ways to cope with the summer heat. In the room belonging to Fawn, experts discovered key evidence, including a few short strands of hair as well as other evidence that might seem insignificant at first glance. All findings were sent to the laboratory for analysis. Furthermore, valuable items disappeared from the house, including several radios, a video game console, and a stereo cassette player. Some items were found on the ground near the house, giving the impression that they were thrown out of the window to be collected from below later, but were left behind for some reason. The investigators also found that various items had been removed from a closet in an adjacent bedroom on the 2nd floor. In their opinion, The perpetrator might have used this closet as a hiding place while waiting for the residents of the house to fall asleep. Normally, the Fawn sisters slept in this room at night, but on that particular night they had stayed elsewhere, which is why the moved items went unnoticed. During the investigation into Fawn's case, investigators came across an unusual find. An old military cap was found in her bedroom, the existence of which no one in Fawn's circle knew about. This led the police to believe that the perpetrator might have accidentally left this item at the crime scene. However, despite the many pieces of evidence collected, finding the perpetrator was not easy, as in the year 1989, DNA analysis technology was not as advanced as it is today, and there was no unified DNA database. Investigator Benjamin Caldwell expressed the suspicion that several people familiar with the layout of the house might have been involved in the crime. The perpetrators must have known how to reach the second floor in the dark by going around the backyard and been aware of the arrangement of the rooms in the house. The attempt to find witnesses who could shed light on the events of that night was unsuccessful. Questioning of neighbors, friends, and relatives of Fawn yielded no significant information that could help the investigation. An additional difficulty was the area where the house was located. It was a rather poor neighborhood, known for the activity of various gangs. The difficulties in bringing members of these groups to justice significantly complicated the investigators' work. A month after the incident, the investigation suddenly gained new momentum with the appearance of a witness. This person shared information with the investigators about 3 young people who seemed suspicious, pointing to them as possible perpetrators. The peculiarity of his testimony lay in details that were unknown to the general public and had not been released by the police, which gave his words weight. As a result, 3 young men were arrested, including one who had previously attended the same school as Fawn. Despite their denial of any connection to the incident, a search of one of the suspects' homes led to the discovery of items belonging to Fawn. This find temporarily made them the main figures in the investigation. However, the investigation encountered obstacles. The witness suddenly retracted his original statements and ceased all cooperation with the police. Furthermore, the analysis of the DNA and the hair found at the crime scene did not yield a clear result. The technology at the time was not yet advanced enough to establish or rule out a 100% match with the suspect's DNA, so the results remained inconclusive, confirming neither the guilt nor the innocence of the suspects. Despite the fact that the results of the DNA test remained inconclusive, the investigation team managed to obtain valuable information from one of the arrested individuals. When questioned, he said that he and his friends went into the house that night and took some valuables. In describing his way into the house, he mentioned how he reached the second floor by using the canopy. Furthermore, he mentioned some details that were previously unknown to the investigation team, for example, about the incident with the cassette recorder, whose handle broke off and was hidden by him under a bush next to the house. The investigators found the said item exactly where the arrested person said. Nevertheless, he later recanted his statement and stopped cooperating with the police, which made it impossible to use his confession as evidence in court. Because of this and the lack of further evidence, the police were forced to release the arrested individuals, and the investigation once again reached a dead end. Interestingly, one of those involved in the incident spent 8 months in prison because of items that had gone missing from a house belonging to Fawn. Afterward, the case was temporarily closed and moved to the archives. At the beginning of the 2000s, the police resumed the investigation by first uploading the DNA samples found at the crime scene into the newly created database. In this database, the DNA profiles of individuals who had been convicted of various crimes were stored. Unfortunately, no one among them was found who matched the collected samples. Advances in science, particularly in DNA analysis, led to the creation of a new database that represented a turning point in the investigation of Fawn's case. Thanks to this progress, the police were able to reanalyze the DNA profiles of 3 original suspects using more modern methods. To everyone's surprise, none of the samples matched the evidence found at the crime scene. This fact was particularly unsettling, as the suspects possessed personal items belonging to Fawn. The investigators concluded that on the night of the crime, not only were the 3 suspects in Fawn's house, possibly looking for their belongings, but also a fourth person who was apparently the actual perpetrator. This assumption led to even more questions. How could 4 people enter the house unnoticed, commit the act, and disappear just as unnoticed? This question remained unanswered, and the case once again reached a dead end. With the passing years, the Fawn family's belief that the truth would come to light diminished more each day. They are still convinced that the 3 men who were in their house that night know the key to the crime, but prefer to remain silent. The only hope for the family now lies in DNA samples that are stored in the police laboratory and could shed light on the mystery. In the year 2018, an incident occurred which Amber, Fawn's younger sister, reported on. She shared details about the crime on a well-known American forum specializing in unsolved cases, which were previously unknown to the police. In its 23 years of existence, the forum has earned a solid reputation, as its users have repeatedly contributed to solving significant cases. After Amber verified her identity, this lent credibility to her words. She recounted that at the moment the mother and the younger daughter were not at home, as they were picking her up from work, and her father was asleep in the house. The criminals took the opportunity to enter and hide in a closet in one of the empty rooms on the 2nd floor, waiting for the moment the entire family would be asleep. According to Amber, there were at least 2 individuals among the criminals who knew Fawn personally. One of them was her classmate, and the other had met her at church a few days before the incident. Amber was present at their meeting and noticed that one of the boys showed a romantic interest in Fawn. Amber's account revealed that the crime was planned in advance and the disappearance of items was only a part of their plan. This information, revealed on the forum, attracted special attention and could be a key element in solving the case. Amber insisted that everything was planned in advance and it was not a random incident, as the police assumed. The police suspect that the 3 boys entered the house in search of valuables before deciding to commit a more serious crime. But Amber was sure that they acted intentionally. She explained that there was nothing in their modest home that could attract attention. Furthermore, she noted that the perpetrators used items belonging to her younger sister from the adjacent room, which pointed to their pre-planning. Amber also noted that the perpetrators likely knew her family's routine, which allowed them to remain in the house unnoticed. On weekdays, Amber worked as a nanny and was only home during the day, while she spent the weekends in her room on the 1st floor, where the 3 boys were also accommodated. She suspected that if the perpetrators had not watched the house, they would have risked being discovered. The girl also said that the perpetrators must have watched the house to know when her mother and younger sister would be picking her up from work, which would have given them the opportunity to enter unnoticed. Despite all the evidence from Amber, it did not help much in the investigation of this incident. In the year 2018, progress in the Institute for DNA Analysis made giant leaps. Many cases that had been forgotten for decades were solved through modern technologies. The Fawn family, observing these successes, could not understand why the police investigation into their case was not reopened. Their repeated inquiries to the investigators were always met with the same explanation. For a detailed DNA analysis, we need funds. And there are dozens of such cases that require our attention. Thus, the family had no choice but to wait for funding and their turn. However, in the year 2019, the family decided to take matters into their own hands and started to raise funds. They wanted to cover all the costs for the DNA analysis and even announced a reward of $10,000 for information that could lead to the arrest of the perpetrator. Their initiative received wide coverage in the media, and thanks to numerous interviews with the relatives, many compassionate people responded to the call for help. Thanks to this, the required amount was collected quite quickly. But unfortunately, even after such efforts, a disappointment awaited the family. The police department rejected the Fawn family's request to expedite the investigation by conducting a DNA analysis at their own expense. The main reason for the refusal was that granting such an opportunity to one family would create a precedent that could lead to numerous requests from other families in similar situations. According to the investigators, this would not be feasible due to the limited number of laboratories capable of performing such advanced analyses. Nevertheless, these laboratories have made significant strides in genetic research, from finding relatives via DNA to creating facial composites based on genetic data. The Fawn family was convinced that the delay in the investigation was related to their social and financial status, as they lived in a less affluent area. In an interview, Fawn's sister expressed the opinion that if it had concerned wealthier or more influential people, the investigation would have progressed much faster. Despite all their efforts, the family did not succeed in speeding up the process. However, at the end of the year 2020, a significant breakthrough occurred in the case, which was unexpected for the Fawn family. With funding from the FBI, DNA samples taken from Fawn's room were sent to a specialized laboratory to conduct a deep analysis and search for possible relatives of the DNA's owner. In the laboratory, scientists focused on examining a specific genetic material found at the scene of the incident. By November 2020, the researchers managed to determine that the found DNA belonged to Donald Cox, a second cousin of Fawn, which was a surprise to the entire family. At that time, Donald was 21 years old, and no one in the family suspected him of being involved in any crimes. Nevertheless, Donald was known for his difficult character and regular stays in prison for various minor offenses. Unfortunately, at that time, DNA samples were not yet taken for analysis from persons who had committed such offenses, which could have aided in the earlier resolution of the case. Donald disappeared in the year 2006, but the circumstances of his disappearance aroused the suspicion of the police, which is why a sample of his DNA was preserved. Nevertheless, the information about his DNA was never entered into the FBI database, as Donald was not considered a suspect in this specific case. After experts established a 100% match between the samples found at the crime scene and the samples provided by the police, the family finally had answers to questions they had been waiting for 31 years. This discovery, although sad, brought light to details that had remained unclear. It turned out that the 3 original suspects were indeed in the house that night, which explained how they knew the layout of the house and the habits of its inhabitants so well. Donald, one of the suspects, was acquainted with the family and often visited them. Despite these revelations, the police decided to close the case without bringing new charges against the 3 men. Fawn's sister commented that it was pointless to seek confessions from them, as their presence in the house did not necessarily imply involvement in the crime. Perhaps the crime was committed by Donald after he was left alone in the house. The police stated that charges had already been brought against the suspects. Long-standing suspicion and condemnation by society had seriously affected their lives. An interesting fact became known after the case was closed. The police learned of the suspects through relatives of one of them, who noticed a Nintendo game console at his home, similar to the one that had disappeared from Fawn's house. This information became known through the news, and everyone in the county was informed about the events. Despite all the evidence and suspicions, it was not possible to prove the men's involvement in the crime. Nevertheless, Fawn's relatives now know who is behind the crime. The perpetrator was free for 17 years without being held accountable for his actions and continued his contact with the Fawn family until his own lifestyle finally revealed his secret.